Brian knocked on the wooden door in front of him with two knuckles. The sound was sharp and loud in the quiet morning. Behind him stood an entire patrol team in uniform, lined up straight, not a single word spoken. It was the kind of scene that could make time slow down in an ordinary neighborhood. The door cracked open. Mila stepped out. She froze for half a second, but she didn't back away. She just pinched the edge of her shirt between two fingers and looked straight at Brian, like someone trying to stay calm even though her palms were probably turning cold. I stood right behind Brian, a little to the left, so I could see Mila's face clearly. I didn't say anything. My job as a night shift nurse had taught me to observe before reacting, and in that moment, I knew something was very wrong, something no one wanted to admit. Brian rested a hand on the leather holster at his hip. His voice wasn't loud or soft, just cold and clear enough to slip through the crack of the door. We need to verify some information about the old man you've been helping. Mila's eyes widened. She didn't understand. I didn't understand either. And the whole street probably couldn't understand why the military was standing in front of the home of a girl who worked night shifts as a diner waitress. Brian didn't wait for her to ask. He pulled a worn photo from his pocket and held it up in front of Mila. A young man in uniform, sharp eyes, a straight nose. Just one quick look was enough to see the nearly perfect resemblance to the old man Mila had been quietly bringing breakfast to every morning. Mila lifted a hand to her mouth. No way. Her voice dropped, thin as a cut-off breath. Brian pulled the photo back, the movement quick and firm. No explanation. No reason given. Only a silence thick enough to weigh on the air. And right at that moment, I had to rewind to the beginning, to understand how a morning that should have been ordinary turned into a moment that could tear someone's life apart. I met Mila for the first time at the diner near the hospital where I worked. She took the night shifts, her face always a bit tired, but her eyes wide awake. One time, when I was paying after my shift, Mila was packing two breakfasts, one for a regular customer, one for someone who never stepped into the diner. For the old man on the corner, she said when she caught me looking. Her voice was soft, not bragging. He lives alone. That was the first time I heard the name, Walter. Mila always brought his breakfast right on time, left it on the porch, knocked twice, and walked away without waiting for him to open the door. I once asked why she didn't stay to see if he was okay. She only said, "He doesn't like being seen. I just leave it like that." Not how someone talks about a stranger, more like how someone talks when they're protecting another person's privacy. A few days later, I walked past Walter's house. The door was always locked, but inside I heard a heavy, dry cough, like someone trying to swallow their pain so no one would notice. I stopped for a few seconds. My years as a nurse told me that wasn't a normal cough. It sounded like someone who'd been sick for a long time but refused to seek care. When I told Mila, she nodded like she was already used to it. The other day, his hand was shaking so much he almost dropped the food container, Mila said, and there were old burn scars on his arm, like someone who used to do dangerous work. I asked, "Did he say anything?" Mila looked out the window, lowering her voice like she was afraid of breaking whatever story he carried. He said, "The boy must be grown by now." Then he stopped talking. What boy? I didn't know. Mila didn't know either. But I remembered that line clearly. That night, I told Brian while he was changing after his shift. He froze for a second when I mentioned the scars. Then the next thing Mila had said made him bend over the table, gripping the strap of his cap tight. He said the boy must be grown by now? Brian asked again. His voice was low, flat. I nodded. Brian stared at the table, like he'd just heard something he never wanted to hear. But he didn't say more. He just changed the subject in a way so clumsy that I knew he was thinking about something much deeper. From that day on, Brian started asking me about Walter. In a strange, careful way. Is he tall? How does he walk? Does he sound like he's from anywhere in particular? He didn't ask fast, but he asked steadily. Every question sounded like he was trying to confirm a memory he wasn't sure he even believed. I thought it was just curiosity. But by the time he stood in front of Mila's door with a full patrol team, I knew that curiosity had become something else, a suspicion he had been trying to hide, even from himself. On the front porch, Brian looked at Mila again. "Where is he?" His voice was so cold it felt like even the wind stopped above the roof. Mila swallowed. I brought his food like always, but today he didn't open the door." Brian looked at me. I looked back. That was when I understood. What we were about to walk into wasn't just about confirming an old man's identity. It was the beginning of a truth big enough to rewrite everything Brian had believed his whole life. And from that moment, none of us could step back. After Mila said Walter hadn't opened the door that morning, Brian told the patrol team to spread out and check the area. I stood behind him, watching Mila's face. She was still holding herself together, but her eyes kept darting toward Walter's house, like she was waiting for him to come out and say, "It's okay, I just overslept." But the house stayed silent, as if the door was locked from the inside by the fear of the man living there. That afternoon, I stopped by the diner where Mila worked. She had just finished her shift and was resting her elbows on the table, her fingers tapping lightly in a rhythm I recognized as her habit whenever she was worried. "I know what you're going to ask," Mila said before I even opened my mouth. She pulled a beige cloth from her pocket. "Yesterday afternoon he dropped this when he took the food. His hand was shaking hard. He always shakes, but that day it felt like he was scared of something more than the illness." I touched the edge of the cloth. It was dry, a bit stiff, and I noticed a long burnt mark on the corner. Mila continued, "The scars on his arm. They're the kind you see on people who've been hit by flame up close. I serve a few veterans. You can tell." She paused, her eyes drifting as if she was trying to decode Walter's expression that day. "He was holding a picture too," Mila said quietly. "Really old. When I got close, he hid it under his coat right away. I only caught a glimpse of a brown-haired kid standing next to someone in uniform." I felt my heart beat slow for a second. "Did he say anything?" Mila nodded slightly. Just one sentence. Slow, rough, like saying it hurt him. "The boy must be grown by now." The air between us stalled. That line echoed in my head like a memory that didn't belong to me. That night when I got home, I found Brian sitting in his study, the blue light from the screen casting sharp shadows along his jaw. He was looking at military records on the internal system list of missing soldiers, those reported dead with no body ever recovered. "What are you looking for?" I asked. Brian shut the screen faster than normal. "Nothing." He said it too calmly to be believable. I left him alone, but when he walked out of the room, I went in to put some things back on the shelf. While I was setting down a storage box, the lid popped open. Inside was a broken badge, sharp-edged, the rim burned. I had seen that exact kind of badge in the picture Mila described, from a young soldier, from Walter when he was young. Brian had never told me he kept something like that. I closed the box before he came back, but from that moment on, I understood. Brian wasn't just suspicious. He already knew something he wasn't ready to say out loud. The next day, Brian drove to his mother's house. He didn't let me come with him. I stood by the window watching his car leave the driveway, feeling like something inside us was being stretched to the point of tearing. When Brian came home late that night, he didn't say a word. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat down, head lowered, hands clasped together. I sat beside him and didn't ask anything. A moment later, his phone rang. His mother's voice came through the speaker, quiet but clear enough for me to hear every word. "It's not him. Stop looking." Do you know the feeling when glass cracks and then shatters into 1,000 pieces? Brian's face looked exactly like that, except it broke without a sound. He stood up, walked straight into the garage, and slammed the door so hard the wall trembled. For the first time, I saw him lose control like that. 2 days later, Mila and I ran into each other near Walter's house. She was looking toward his door, her face tense, not from fear but from worry. "Someone's been watching him," Mila said, almost whispering. "When?" I asked. "Twice. Same guy. Black jacket. Standing at the end of the alley." "A stranger?" "No. His posture was too straight. More like someone who's used to standing on a military base." Her words sent a cold rush down my back. Mila went on, "This morning I brought his food. I heard something heavy dragging across the floor. When I opened the door, he was trying to pull a suitcase out to the porch, but he fell. I couldn't catch him in time." I clenched my hands when I heard that. "Did he say anything?" Mila nodded. "Yeah. He said, if he knows I'm still alive, he won't let me go." She swallowed hard, like she still couldn't believe she'd heard it right. Rachel. He was truly scared. Scared enough to want to leave right away, even though his body couldn't handle it. I stared at the dark, quiet house in front of us. An old, sick man. Someone who once served in the military. Now dragging a suitcase to run from his own life because the past was coming for him in the cruelest way. Injustice doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes with the unsteady steps of an old man trying not to fall when no one is standing on his side anymore. When I got home, Brian was standing at the kitchen counter, back straight, hands pressed against the edge like he was holding back a thought that was tearing him apart. "I met Mila," I said. Brian didn't turn around. "He's being watched," I said, "and he knows it. He's scared enough to run. Alone." Brian let out a short breath. "I know." That answer stopped me cold. "The day my mom said stop looking," Brian continued, "I realized she knew more than she was willing to tell me. I didn't push him." Brian lifted his head. His eyes were cold, sharp, and carried the resolve of someone who'd spent too long standing in the dark. "I'm not letting him disappear again," he said. And in that moment, I knew. We weren't just looking for an old man anymore. We were chasing a truth someone had buried under years of dust, a truth that was now cornering a frail man with nowhere left to run. After the night Brian said, "I'm not letting him disappear again," he started working with the urgency of someone who knew he didn't have many chances left. He gathered everything Walter had ever touched, the beige cloth Mila gave him, a glass with a faint lip mark, even a loose button the old man had dropped on the porch. He sealed everything in evidence bags and signed the papers to send them to the military lab. "Who are you trying to find in these results?" I asked. Brian didn't look at me. "Not who. What?" One answer was enough for me to know this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. The results came back 2 days later. A thin envelope, but Brian held it like it carried the weight to change everything he'd believed since he was a child. He ripped it open in one cold, steady motion. The paper slid onto the table. I saw the first line. Comparison sample. Direct paternal DNA match. There was no second interpretation. No room for error. Walter, the old man, the whole neighborhood thought was hiding from the world, was Brian's biological father. Brian stood there for a long time. He didn't bend down. He didn't touch the paper. But his whole body tightened, like someone had hit a buried part of his memory he never knew he'd been carrying. In the records, he was listed as dead, I said quietly. "I know." Brian's voice was flat enough to be frightening. We went to the military base to cross-check the old files. The officer in charge of archives opened the storage room and pulled out a thick, dusty folder from the unit Walter once belonged to. The first page confirmed what we both heard our whole lives, killed in action. But the second page carried a different handwriting. A note added years later. Record updated at the request of family member. The officer said, "This kind of case is rare, but not unheard of. When a soldier comes back with memory damage or loses the ability to recognize family, sometimes the family requests an update to the record to avoid causing psychological distress to young children. I looked at Brian. Right then, I knew he'd realized who had asked for the record to be changed. Who signed as the family member? I asked. The officer opened the verification list. Brian's eyes stopped when he saw the name. He didn't have to say it. I knew. His mother was the one who signed. He didn't react. He didn't ask why. He just gave a small nod, like someone who just confirmed a truth he never wanted to believe. And Walter? Brian asked. The officer turned to the last page. No one found him after his treatment. He left the facility one morning and disappeared. No one knew where he went. No one knew if he lived or died until he showed up in our neighborhood, older, weaker, and without the memories he once had. A team of soldiers was sent to Walter's house to confirm his identity. Brian went with them. Milan and I followed behind. The door opened easily, like someone had walked out not long ago. No smell of old food, no coughing, no fresh footprints. The living room was tidy in a way that didn't feel natural. Furniture moved back into place. Blanket folded neatly. Only one thing sat on the table. An old photo of a little boy in a blue jacket. Brian at about 3 years old. I heard Mila suck in a breath. Brian didn't move. He stared at the photo like he was looking at his own past, but through someone else's memory. One of the soldiers reported, "No signs of struggle. Looks like he left on his own." Brian asked, "Any sign of the suitcase?" "Yes." One was dragged across the floor toward the door. My heartbeat dropped. Walter, sick and frail, had dragged a suitcase by himself to leave the only place that still offered him any cover. He wasn't running from life. He was running from someone who wanted to keep him in the dark for far too long. As the team prepared to leave, Mila pulled me aside. Her hands were shaking, not because she feared the soldiers, but because of what she'd been holding inside. "I need to tell you this." Brian turned when he heard her voice. She looked at both of us, then spoke slowly, carefully, like she was afraid she might break the last thing Walter left behind. "The last day I saw him, Walter said, 'Someone wants me dead forever. I have to go before they come.'" None of us said a word. That one line slammed shut every quiet space we had tried to keep open. Leaving Walter's house, Brian didn't walk fast or slow. He just walked straight ahead, expression unchanged. But I knew he was putting the pieces together. The altered record. Walter disappearing from the treatment facility, his mother saying, "Stop looking." A man in black watching Walter's house, and Walter saying, "They want to keep me dead forever." This wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't a vague feeling. A truth was rising, cold and sharp like a blade. Walter didn't disappear because of his memory. He disappeared because someone didn't want the past to ever come back. On the way home, Brian said only one sentence, his voice catching for half a beat, but still carrying that familiar cold edge. "I'm asking my mother. This time, she's going to tell me everything." And I knew. What was left, the deepest, heaviest part, was waiting ahead. No one could avoid it now. Brian didn't wait. The next morning, he drove out while the sky was still pale with mist. He asked me to come with him, not to share the moment, but to witness it. "I want to know if he left any trace behind," Brian said, eyes fixed ahead. We went to the church at the end of the neighborhood. The priest recognized Walter's photo the moment Brian showed it. He said the old man often sat on the bench near the side door at dawn. "He didn't talk?" I asked. The priest shook his head lightly. "He did. Once. He asked for directions toward the edge of the woods, but when I asked why, he only said, 'I need to stay away from someone.'" We left the church with another piece of the puzzle. The second stop was the old clinic at the far end of the street. An elderly nurse recognized Walter instantly. He came here 2 weeks ago, she said. Not for treatment. He just sat waiting, like someone who wanted to make sure he wasn't being watched anymore. Not being watched. That line and what Mila had told us fit together like two pieces cut from the same cloth. Brian nodded, locking it into place in his mind. Finally, we went to the park near his house. An old man who fed the birds said Walter used to sit on the last bench by the trees, but he always kept his back to the road. He kept looking around, the man said, like he was waiting for someone to step out from behind him. Brian stayed silent the whole walk back to the car. As we were about to leave, he said something that sounded like a conclusion. He wasn't hiding from illness. He was hiding from someone. That meant we had to return to the only place left with answers, Brian's mother's house. When we arrived, she opened the door on the first knock. Maybe she'd been standing behind it for a long time, waiting for this moment. Brian didn't circle around it. I have the right to know the truth. She turned away, wiping her hands on her apron like someone trying to steady herself before saying something she didn't dare say years ago. She sat down, not collapsing, not defending herself, just exhaled once, deeply. The day your father came home, she began, looking straight at Brian, he barely remembered anything. He didn't remember me. He didn't remember the house. He didn't remember you. Brian didn't move, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes cold. He'd be aware for a moment, then forget again. When he remembered, he panicked, screaming the names of fallen soldiers. When he forgot, he broke things, smashed windows, like he'd just woken up in the middle of a battlefield. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried the exhaustion of someone who'd held a secret far too long. You were 3 then, she went on. You shook like a leaf when you saw him. You hid behind me, crying so hard you couldn't breathe. You screamed, "Don't let him in," while he was shouting that he didn't know who either of us were. Brian swallowed, but his face didn't change. The doctor said he might recover, she said, but they also said he might. Never. His memory was like a torn piece of cloth. I heard every word like I was rereading an old file, a file covered by the pain of the ones left behind. You know what I did? She looked down at her hands. I chose to end it all. You needed to grow up in peace. You needed a story simpler than the chaos your father brought home. So you asked the military to change the record, Brian said, his voice hollow. She nodded, very slowly. That was my choice. Right or wrong, I've carried it my whole life. None of us said anything else. We didn't need to. The truth sat between the 3 of us. Cold, heavy, but unmistakably clear. That night, Brian's phone rang. A call from the public hospital. We have an elderly patient with no ID. His name is Walter, and he asked us to contact the soldier whose number was in his jacket pocket. We left immediately. Walter was lying in the ER, his face worn down like it had been carved by wind, but his eyes were open, clear, though a little lost under the cold white hospital lights. When Brian walked in, Walter looked at him. For a long time, not like someone recognizing a familiar face right away, but like someone trying to piece together a face he once knew well, but had gotten stuck somewhere in an empty corner of memory. Tears slid down his temples. Silent, Brian stepped closer and stood beside the bed. Walter lifted his hand, slow, weak, shaking like a dry branch touched by wind. Brian took it. No one said anything for a few seconds. Just the rising and falling beep of the heart monitor. Then Walter spoke, his voice rough and low, like every word had to be pulled up from someplace deep. My son, is he living well? That question carried no blame, no demand for what he'd lost, just the care of a father whose mind could hold onto only one thing, that he once had a son. Brian lowered his head slightly, not avoiding it. I grew up not knowing I still had a father, he said slowly. That shouldn't have happened. No shouting, no anger, Just the truth laid out, cold, clear, and painful enough to make the whole room fall quiet. Walter closed his eyes and gently squeezed Brian's hand, as if he'd finally heard something he never had the chance to hear years ago. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching two hands, one shaking, one steady, holding on to each other. And in that silence, I understood. This wasn't a full reconciliation, but for the first time in decades, they were standing on the same side of the truth. Walter was moved to a veterans care center that weekend, a small room with a window looking out to a garden of cold weather plants. The light there was softer, and it no longer felt like he had to hide at every sound the way he had during his last days in the neighborhood. Brian handled the paperwork quickly, not letting me help. He checked every line carefully, like one mistake could make Walter slip out of his hands again. When he finished, he only said, "He'll breathe easier here." From that day on, Brian visited every afternoon, not the kind of visit filled with questions. He just sat in the chair beside the bed, quiet, letting Walter know he wasn't being left behind anymore. Some days Walter slept the whole time. Some days he opened his eyes and looked at Brian for a long time, long enough that I felt he was trying to press his son's face into a memory that kept breaking apart. Brian didn't push him to remember. He didn't bring up the past. He just stayed there, silent, but steady enough for Walter to rest. One afternoon, while I was changing his IV line, Walter said my name softly. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. "Let me see Brian." Brian stepped closer, leaning in just enough to hear him without making Walter strain. Walter placed his thin hand over Brian's and gave a small squeeze, all he had left. "Don't blame your mother," he said slowly. Each word sounded like it was pulled up from the deepest torn place in his memory. "In war, everyone loses a part of themselves. Your mother only tried to protect what was left of you." I turned away, not to hide tears, but to give space to a sentence I knew would stay with Brian for a long time. Brian didn't answer right away. He just set his hand over Walter's, steady, quiet, letting him know he heard and he understood. Walter passed on a quiet morning. I arrived early to switch shifts with the night nurse and saw his room light on, but there was no strained breathing, no alarms. Walter lay there with a calm face, like he had finally put down a suitcase he'd carried for too long. Brian came a few minutes after me. He looked at Walter for a long time, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the bed rail, the posture of someone trying to stay upright with reason even while his chest tightened. Mila came too. She brought a breakfast box out of habit, but this time she didn't leave it on the porch or by the door. She set it right beside his bed. "He never finished it," Mila said quietly, "but I think he liked being remembered." No one disagreed, because she was right. Brian stepped up and stood next to me. His hand found mine and gave a small squeeze, not asking for comfort, but confirming that after everything, at least one thing hadn't been meaningless. "At least I found him," Brian said. His voice didn't shake. It wasn't loud, just honest. I knew he wasn't trying to reassure himself. He said it because it was the one thing no one could take from this story. He found his father, too late to make up for the lost years, but just in time for them to see each other one last time. The funeral was small, quiet. A few veterans stood in the back row, men who had seen Walter sitting alone in his final years without knowing he had carried a secret that heavy. The priest read a few short lines. He didn't talk about mistakes. He didn't talk about a past torn apart. He said only one sentence I'll never forget. "Some people spend their whole life wanting to be seen, and some only need one moment at the end of it to be recognized." I looked at Brian when I heard that. He stood straight, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the casket. No tears, no step back. But I could feel the change in him. like he'd finally put down something he never knew he'd been carrying since childhood. When we left the cemetery, Brian opened the car door for me. Before closing it, he said something short but heavy, true to who he was, cool, steady, but not unfeeling. The truth came late, but it makes it easier to breathe. I nodded, because it wasn't just the truth between him and Walter. It was the truth for so many people. No one chooses what they remember, I said, but everyone can choose how they treat someone else. Brian gave a small smile, barely there, but enough for me to know he'd stepped onto the other side of the pain. And as I share this story, I want you, the one listening, to pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever forgiven someone because they acted out of their own fear? If you have, or if you're in the middle of that feeling now, leave a comment. Maybe what you share will reach someone else who's trying to let go of the same weight. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about real people and real grace. Your support helps me keep telling these with all the care they deserve.